When I showed up to the reading of my grandfather's will, my aunt scoffed. "This is just a formality. We already split everything. You weren't included for a reason." I almost believed her until the lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Actually, the entire estate was left to one person, and it's not any of you." I, 32M, sat in the leather chair across from my grandfather's lawyer, watching my aunt's perfectly manicured nails drum against the mahogany table. She hadn't even looked at me when I walked in 20 minutes late, just continued her conversation with my uncle about their upcoming trip to Monaco. My cousin scrolled through her phone, occasionally showing the screen to her mother and giggling about something I couldn't hear. The lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, adjusted his glasses and opened a thick folder. Before he could speak, my aunt leaned forward with that practiced smile she reserved for people she considered beneath her. She told me this was really just a formality, that they'd already gone through everything and divided it up properly. Her tone suggested I should be grateful they'd even bothered to invite me. She said I wasn't included for a reason, and perhaps it was best if I just signed whatever paperwork was needed and left them to handle the complicated matters. I almost believed her. Almost. My relationship with my grandfather had been strained for the last 5 years, ever since I'd refused to join the family's real estate business and instead became a high school teacher. My aunt had made sure everyone knew about my disappointing life choices at every family gathering. My grandfather had stopped returning my calls 2 years ago. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat, and something in that sound made my aunt stop mid-sentence. He said he needed to clarify something before they proceeded. The entire estate had been left to one person, and it wasn't any of them. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the antique clock on the wall ticking. My aunt's face went through several colors before settling on an alarming shade of red. She demanded to know what kind of joke this was. My uncle stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. My cousin finally looked up from her phone. Mr. Whitmore explained that my grandfather had changed his will 6 months ago. Everything, the portfolio worth approximately $8 million, the family home in Connecticut, the vacation property in Vermont, the controlling shares in the real estate company, all of it was going to me. I sat frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. My aunt's voice rose several octaves as she insisted this was impossible. My grandfather would never do such a thing. She'd been managing his affairs for years. She demanded to see the document. The lawyer slid a copy across the table. My grandfather's signature was there, along with those of 2 witnesses and a notary stamp dated 6 months prior. My aunt snatched it up, her hands shaking as she read. She kept repeating that this couldn't be legal, that my grandfather wasn't in his right mind, that I'd clearly manipulated him somehow. Mr. Whitmore mentioned that my grandfather had anticipated such claims and had included a full mental competency evaluation performed by 3 independent doctors. All had certified him as being of sound mind when he made these changes. My uncle asked why. Why would my grandfather do this? Mr. Whitmore pulled out a letter from the folder and said my grandfather had left an explanation to be read aloud. The lawyer began reading in his measured tone. My grandfather's words filled the room, and I recognized his voice in every sentence. He wrote that he'd spent his last years watching his family carefully, seeing who they really were when they thought he wasn't paying attention. He'd noticed how my aunt had slowly taken control of his finances, always suggesting investments that coincidentally benefited her own portfolio. He'd discovered that she'd been billing personal expenses to his accounts for the past 3 years, shopping trips, her daughter's college tuition, even a kitchen renovation for her own home. When he'd confronted her privately, she'd assured him it was just easier to manage everything together, that she'd pay it back eventually. She never did. My uncle had been even more brazen. He'd used my grandfather's name and reputation to secure business deals, promising clients special access and consideration that my grandfather knew nothing about. Several of these deals had been ethically questionable at best, and my grandfather had spent considerable time quietly cleaning up the mess to protect the company's reputation. My cousin had visited exactly 4 times in 3 years, each visit coinciding with her need for money. She'd never stayed longer than an hour and spent most of that time on her phone. Then my grandfather wrote about me. He mentioned the weekly calls I'd made for years, even after he stopped answering. The birthday cards I'd sent without fail. The way I'd shown up at the hospital when he had pneumonia 2 years ago, even though my aunt had told me it wasn't serious and I shouldn't bother coming. I'd sat with him for 6 hours while he slept, just to make sure someone was there if he woke up confused or scared. He wrote about visiting my classroom once without telling anyone. He'd sat in the back during my American history lesson and watched me work with a struggling student after class, spending my lunch break helping the kid understand the material. He'd seen the thank you notes from students pinned to my wall and the photo of us together on my desk, the only family photo in the room. He'd realized that I was the only one who'd never asked him for anything. The only one who'd chosen a life based on what mattered to me rather than what would impress others or make money. The only one who'd loved him without conditions. The letter concluded with his hope that I would use the inheritance to continue being exactly who I was. He wanted me to know that he was proud of me, even if he'd been too stubborn to say it while he was alive. He hoped I could forgive an old man for his silence. By the time Mr. Whitmore finished reading, my eyes were burning. My aunt had gone completely still, her face now pale. My uncle stood at the window with his back to us. My cousin had tears running down her face, though I suspected they were more about the money than the words. My aunt recovered first, her voice icy as she said this would be contested. She had lawyers who would tear this apart. She'd spent years caring for my grandfather while I was off playing teacher. She'd earned that inheritance. Mr. Whitmore informed her that my grandfather had also anticipated legal challenges. He'd documented everything. The unauthorized expenses, the business deals, all of it. He'd compiled evidence that would not only support the will, but could potentially lead to criminal charges if anyone chose to pursue that route. My grandfather had suggested that accepting the will as written would be in everyone's best interest. My uncle turned from the window and asked what I intended to do with the company. His voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the desperation underneath. Without those controlling shares, he'd be voted out by the other board members within a month. Everyone knew the company's recent success was due to the CFO and the operations team, not my uncle's leadership. I told him I hadn't decided yet. It was the truth. I'd walked into this room expecting nothing, and now I was trying to process the fact that I was suddenly wealthy beyond anything I'd imagined. My aunt made a sound of disgust and said I'd probably run it into the ground within a year. I had no business experience, no understanding of how these things worked. My grandfather's legacy would be destroyed. I looked at her directly for the first time since the reading began. I told her that my grandfather's legacy wasn't a company or a bank account. It was the example he'd set of building something through hard work and integrity. I said I'd learned more about business ethics from his letter than I'd apparently learned from watching her manage his affairs for years. Her face flushed again, and she stood up abruptly. She told her family they were leaving, that she wouldn't sit here and be insulted. Mr. Whitmore reminded her that there were papers to sign acknowledging the reading of the will. She snatched the pen from his hand and scrawled her signature, then stormed out with my uncle and cousin following behind. The door closed, and the silence returned. Mr. Whitmore began organizing the documents, giving me time to process. He mentioned that I should take a few days before making any major decisions. The estate was complex, and there were competent people in place managing most of it. I didn't need to change everything immediately. I asked him if my grandfather had really compiled evidence against them. He confirmed it, pulling out another folder. Bank statements showing the unauthorized transfers, emails about the questionable business deals, even screenshots of my cousin's social media posts showing expensive purchases made right after her visits to ask for money. My grandfather had been thorough. I thought about my aunt's face when she'd realized what she'd lost. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction at her shock, but mostly I just felt sad. My grandfather had spent his final months documenting his family's greed instead of enjoying whatever time he had left. He died knowing that the people he'd built his wealth for had only cared about the wealth itself. Mr. Whitmore asked if I had any questions. I had hundreds, but I started with the most practical ones. What were my immediate obligations? What decisions needed to be made quickly? He walked me through the basics. The estate would take months to fully settle, but I had access to accounts for immediate expenses, and the various managers and trustees would continue their work until I decided otherwise. Then I asked about the company. He explained that I now owned 51% of the shares. My uncle owned 15%, my aunt owned 10% through a trust my grandfather had set up years ago, and the remaining 24% was split among other investors and key employees. I had full control if I wanted it. Update 1. I spent 3 days reading through everything my grandfather had left me. Not just the financial documents, but personal papers I found in his study, letters he'd written but never sent, journals where he'd documented his thoughts about the family, plans he'd made and abandoned. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd loved deeply and been disappointed profoundly. On the fourth day, I called a board meeting. My uncle looked nervous when I walked in. The other board members, people I'd never met, watched me with curious expressions. I'd worn my best suit, which still wasn't as expensive as anything my uncle had on, but I'd stopped caring about that. I told them I'd reviewed the company's performance over the past 5 years. I'd hired an independent consultant to give me a breakdown of what worked and what didn't, who contributed and who coasted. I said I knew most of them were concerned about having an inexperienced majority shareholder, and that concern was valid. My uncle relaxed slightly, probably assuming I was about to announce I'd stay out of operations. Instead, I said I was removing him as CEO effective immediately. The consultant had made it clear that the company's success had happened despite his leadership, not because of it. He'd made questionable decisions that the team had worked around, taken credit for other people's ideas, and created a toxic environment where people were afraid to contradict him. His face went purple. He started to protest, but I kept talking. I'd promoted the CFO to CEO. She'd actually been running things anyway, and I was restructuring the executive compensation to reward actual performance. I was also implementing a strict ethics policy with outside oversight. Anyone who had problems with these changes could resign, and I'd accept those resignations effective immediately. I looked at my uncle and told him he had a choice. He could resign from the board with a severance package that would keep him comfortable, or he could stay and be subject to the same performance reviews as everyone else. If he stayed and didn't meet expectations, he'd be terminated without the severance. He asked what kind of severance. I named a figure that was generous, but nowhere near what he'd expected to inherit. He stood up, told me I'd regret this, and walked out. I never saw him again, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Florida and was struggling to maintain the lifestyle he'd become accustomed to. The rest of the meeting went smoothly. The CFO turned CEO assured me she'd earned the trust one was placing in her. Several other board members thanked me for making changes they'd wanted to see for years, but couldn't push through while my uncle had my grandfather's proxy. My aunt tried a different approach. She called and asked to meet for coffee, her voice warm and friendly in a way it had never been before. She said we needed to talk family business, that we'd both been emotional at the reading and should try to start fresh. I met her at a cafe downtown. She ordered the most expensive thing on the menu and spent 10 minutes talking about how difficult everything had been, how stressed she'd been managing my grandfather's affairs, how she'd only ever wanted what was best for him. Then she got to her point. She said she wanted to help me manage the inheritance. She had experience, connections, knowledge I'd need. She could introduce me to the right people, help me avoid mistakes. In exchange, she'd need a reasonable salary for her consulting services and perhaps a small adjustment to the will's distribution. Nothing major, just enough to reflect the years she'd dedicated to my grandfather's care. I asked her if she remembered the part of the reading where my grandfather had documented all her unauthorized expenses. Her smile faltered. I told her I'd had forensic accountants go through everything. The total she'd taken over 3 years was close to $400,000. I could either report it and let law enforcement handle it, or she could sign an agreement to pay it back in monthly installments over the next 10 years. She said I couldn't be serious. That money had been for family expenses, for taking care of my grandfather's needs. I pulled out the spreadsheet showing designer handbags, jewelry, and luxury vacations. I asked which of those had been for my grandfather's needs. Her expression hardened into something I'd never seen before, something cold and calculating. She told me I was making a mistake, that I'd end up alone with all this money and no one who cared about me. I was burning bridges I'd regret losing. I told her those bridges had never existed. She'd never cared about me as a person, just as a potential resource or obstacle. I said I'd email her the repayment agreement, and she had 1 week to sign it or I'd file a police report. She left without paying for her meal. I picked up the check and left a generous tip for the server who'd had to witness the whole awkward conversation. Update 2. 6 months after the reading, I'd settled into a routine. I kept teaching because I loved it, though I'd reduced to part-time. The rest of my time went to learning about the various investments and properties, working with advisors to structure everything properly, and figuring out what I actually wanted to do with this unexpected wealth. My aunt signed the repayment agreement 3 days before the deadline. She'd had her own lawyers review it and realized I'd been generous. I could have added interest and penalties but hadn't. The monthly payments were manageable if she adjusted her lifestyle. I heard from my cousin that she'd sold one of her cars and canceled the country club membership. My cousin reached out separately, asking if we could talk. I agreed to meet her for lunch. She looked different than she had at the reading, less polished, more uncertain. She apologized for how she'd acted, for only visiting my grandfather when she needed money, for not appreciating him while he was alive. She said reading his letter had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about herself. I asked what she wanted from me. She flinched at the directness, but said she deserved that. She told me she didn't want money or favors. She wanted to know if there was any way to make things right between us, if we could maybe try to be actual family instead of strangers who shared DNA. I asked her what had changed. She explained that losing the inheritance had forced her to reevaluate everything. She'd been living beyond her means, expecting my grandfather's money to eventually bail her out. Now she was working 2 jobs to cover her expenses and had started seeing a therapist to figure out why she'd become the kind of person who valued money over relationships. I told her I'd be willing to try if she was serious about changing. I wasn't ready to trust her completely, but I could offer her the same thing my grandfather had taught me, that people could earn trust through consistent actions over time. She seemed relieved and said that was more than she deserved. We started meeting once a month for lunch. No talk about money or the inheritance, just 2 people trying to understand each other. It was awkward at first, but it got easier. She told me about her jobs and her therapy. I told her about my students and the work I was doing with the company. Slowly, carefully, we built something that resembled a real relationship. I used part of the inheritance to establish a scholarship fund at my school for students who wanted to pursue careers in teaching. My grandfather's letter had mentioned being impressed by my dedication to education, and this felt like the right way to honor that. I named it after him, and the first year we were able to provide full scholarships to 3 students. I also started a foundation focused on elder care and protecting seniors from financial exploitation. I'd learned while settling the estate that what my aunt had done was surprisingly common. Family members slowly taking control of an elderly relative's finances and using them for personal gain. The foundation funded legal services for seniors who suspected abuse and educational programs to help them protect themselves. The company continued to thrive under new leadership. The CEO I'd promoted implemented changes that improved both profitability and employee satisfaction. Several people who'd been considering leaving decided to stay. We won industry awards for workplace culture and ethical business practices. My uncle tried to sue to overturn the will about 8 months in. His lawyers argued undue influence and questioned my grandfather's mental state. The case fell apart quickly when Mr. Whitmore presented all the documentation my grandfather had prepared. The judge dismissed it and ordered my uncle to pay court costs. I heard he'd had to sell his house to cover his legal bills. I couldn't feel happy about his situation, but I didn't feel guilty either. He'd made his choices just as I'd made mine. My grandfather had simply ensured that those choices had appropriate consequences. The family home in Connecticut was too big for one person, but I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Instead, I converted it into a retreat center for teachers. Several times a year, we'd host workshops and relaxation programs for educators who were burned out and needed time to recharge. I kept my grandfather's study exactly as he'd left it, and sometimes I'd sit in his chair and read through his papers, feeling connected to him in a way I never had when he was alive. I found a letter he'd written to me but never sent, dated about a year before he died. In it, he'd apologized for his silence, explained that he'd been ashamed of how the rest of the family had turned out and hadn't known how to talk to me about it. He'd written that watching me choose teaching over money had reminded him why he'd built his business in the first place, not to accumulate wealth, but to create something meaningful and support his family. He'd lost sight of that somewhere along the way, but seeing me had helped him remember. He'd ended the letter by saying he was proud of me and asking if I'd forgive him for being distant. He hoped we'd have a chance to rebuild our relationship, to spend time together talking about things that mattered instead of business and money. We never got that chance. He died 3 months after writing the letter, and I'd only found it after reading the will. But in a way, through his careful planning and the truth he'd left behind, we'd had that conversation after all. He'd told me what I needed to hear, and I'd finally understood what he'd been trying to teach me. I took the teaching job full-time again after a year of managing the estate. I'd hired good people to handle the investments in the company, and I trusted them to do their work. I set up my life so I could focus on what I loved, being in a classroom, working with students, making a difference in small but meaningful ways. Some of my colleagues knew about the inheritance, others didn't. I lived in a comfortable but modest apartment, drove a reliable car, and spent money on experiences rather than things. I took students on field trips to historical sites they couldn't otherwise afford to visit. I bought supplies for kids whose families struggled. I funded classroom projects that brought history to life. My grandfather's legacy wasn't the millions he'd accumulated or the company he'd built. It was the reminder that how we treat people matters more than what we own, that integrity and kindness have value beyond any bank account, and that the relationships we nurture are the only things we take with us when we're gone. I understood now why he'd chosen me to inherit everything. It wasn't about punishing my aunt and uncle, though they'd certainly been punished. It was about entrusting his wealth to the one person who'd proven they didn't need it to be happy, who understood that money was a tool for doing good rather than a measure of worth. Every year on the anniversary of his death, I visited his grave and told him about the scholarship recipients, the teachers who'd been helped by the retreat center, the seniors we'd protected through the foundation. I told him about my slowly rebuilding relationship with my cousin and how I was using his gift to make the kind of difference he'd wanted to make. And every year, I thanked him for teaching me that the best revenge isn't cruelty or spite. It's living well, choosing kindness, and proving that the values people dismissed as weakness are actually the greatest strength of all. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe and hype button would mean the world to us. Please subscribe and press the hype button. Thanks in advance.